I think St. George and retirement syndrome, that famous old description, Don Quixote syndrome, you're trying to be a knight years after the era of the knights errant ended. I mean, I think that's a pretty accurate description. So the underlying baseline fact here is that the civil rights movement was a smashing victory now close to a century ago, if you're talking about the first components of that. Yeah. I mean, I'm from the northern, and obviously we'll get into Brown versus Board, but I mean, I'm from the northern portion of the United States, and my high school, I think, in fact, I know has been integrated since the 1930s. So, I mean, that obviously racial conflict by that point wasn't over in the USA, but Brown versus Board, I mean, mandated desegregation, at least technically, even in the South, took place in 1954. The Civil Rights Act, making racism civilly and in some cases criminally illegal, or let's say racial discrimination, that was 1964. And I mean, the entire process, the end game of the first round of the civil rights movement, I mean, the assassinations of Kennedy, King, all of this took place 50, 60 odd years ago. The one example that I use here is we've had pro-minority affirmative action in the United States at a large scale since the Philadelphia Plan in 1967. Now, again, no serious person thinks that the existence of pro-minority affirmative action means racism doesn't exist or something like that. But the primary victory, so in 1967, it's 2022. It's the 55 years ago was the initiation of affirmative action, not of desegregation. Again, ethnic conflict has not ended. Ethnic conflict, like the poor, will be ever with us, probably. But this is something that when I was growing up wasn't really disputed outside of, again, a few academic debating salons. I saw it a little bit when I got to, say, the University of Illinois. Even there it was muted. But the idea at this time seemed to pretty much be that the civil rights conflicts of the past were in the past. And what remained to ensure equality was enforce the Civil Rights Act, perhaps allow some private sector affirmative action and let people move forward. Yep. Reparations was a fringe idea at the time, so on down the line. And I guess I still think this is correct. I don't describe myself as radically conservative. I mean, when Bill Clinton was in office, I was a Bill Clinton Democrat. Like most urban Black and Irish and Italian guys who'd just gotten old enough to vote. And in many ways, I'm still a Bill Clinton Democrat. So I don't think that what we've seen is the ordinary American sort of working man, or for that matter, center-right business person, which is what I was prior to academia, really moving dramatically to the right of the spectrum. I think we've seen the center of intellectual energy in the country shifting left away from them. That's obviously what's happened. And that's been tracked by some of the better papers in political science. So the first point the civil rights movement won is just inescapable. I think what you're describing is a downstream result of that to some extent.
Yes. Yeah.
So the would-be St. George's no longer have the old dragons to slay. What about Southern segregation? Well, that's been over for 65 years. Okay, well, what about the legality of racism? There hasn't been any such thing for 58 years. Could we get some system into place that will actually advantage minorities to make up for the past, a kind of quasi-reparations? Well, if you look at affirmative action or even poverty policy, that's been in place for 50 years. So I think what you see a lot of on the progressive left is, frankly, the redefinition of terms to create new enemies to fight. That is entirely the sort of Ken DeAngelis take on racism, for example.
Yeah.
The argument now is that any system that produces disparate outcomes among groups, like intelligence testing, must be racist because the only options in terms of that gap are genetic inferiority, which no one wants to admit and which isn't real, or racism. The reality, of course, is that that's just complete BS. One group could study slightly more for the test. Asians kick both white and Black Americans' asses. Even moving away from things like that, which at least imply some cultural gap, although cultural gaps exist all the time and they are not controversial, there are many other variables. I mean, if you're talking about income or crime rate, it's relevant that the average Black guy is a decade younger than the average white guy. I mean, if you want to move that to the modal average, the most common age for whites is 58. Most common age for Blacks is 27. So whether you're talking about wealth on the left or crime on the right, you're being completely disingenuous if you don't point out that the Black guy is 31 years younger than the white guy.
Yeah.
I mean, so all of this, these arguments are incredibly weak, the ones that are coming from the current prog left, in my opinion. But the reason they're weak is that there's still the desire to slay the dragon, but the dragon isn't what it used to be. You're out there hunting wyverns. And I personally think that there are probably better things to do with your time than hunting wyverns. But
yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, the really last sentence here, I think that the institutional structure that we've both agreed on is a problem here. So, I mean, it's easy to make these comments and toss out a few jokes and say, well, why don't they just go do something else? There's still probably some women's rights issues out there. The reason it's not that simple is that the organizations, the ACLU, the SPLC, which we both used to admire, exist. They're not going to tear down their building, that fortified SPLC center, those lawyers that focus on race, and go do something else, help out the developing world or some such. So we have to find a way to get past these redefinitions of non-problems into problems. And that's the tough issue from a leadership perspective.